commandment in the Old Testament. Of course, the law begins with 10 commandments that God gives Moses on Mount Sinai. But according to the rabbis, if you look at the whole Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, there are 613 commandments. 365 of those are negative commandments. You shall not do something. 365 corresponding to the number of days in a year. 248 of those commandments are positive. You shall do this. And according to their count, that corresponded to the number of limbs or organs in the human body. And so as the rabbis were wont to do, they give tremendous and I think valuable symbolic significance to the number of commandments. But it also reminds us what a normal question this is. If you say to me, look, to be part of this faith, here are these 613 rules you have to follow.
Right.
I think the first thing I'm going to say is, whoa, what? That's a lot. What really matters?
Yeah. How do you keep up with all that? First of all, like as a human being.
So there have been, I guess the point I want to make is Jesus is not, Jesus is not the first person to be asked this question, nor to give an answer to it. Mm-hmm. So just to name a few, Hosea. God says through Hosea, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, not knowledge of God and not burnt offerings. Mm-hmm. So relationship with God. Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God? Galatians 5:15, Paul says, the whole law is summed up in this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. In the Babylonian Talmud, the great Rabbi Hillel had a Gentile say, if you can explain to me the whole law while standing on one foot, I'll convert to your religion. And Hillel said, what you yourself hate, do not do that to your neighbor. This is the whole law.
Right.
So my point is, it's both understandable and it had happened a number of times that people, some I think with pure motives, some interested in theological debate, have asked this question. For Christians, of course, we want to hear the answer that Jesus gives. Right. And in both Matthew and Mark, he blends Deuteronomy 6 with Leviticus 19. Both Matthew and Mark give us Deuteronomy 6:5. Love the Lord with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your strength. Mark backs up a verse, which I find helpful. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Monotheism, belief in one God, was not common in ancient Near East religions, and it is clearly the distinguishing characteristic of Judaism. And in Deuteronomy and in Mark, there is this reminder that is the basis for our faith. We believe that we worship the one true God. And because this is the one God, this God deserves our complete devotion. Another reminder that this question was asked and answered a lot. In our Bible, we have 5 versions of this commandment. The Jews referred to this commandment as the Shema. Shema is the word hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And Deuteronomy 6:7 says, recite this verse when you are up or awake and when you are lying down or getting ready to go to sleep. And by the time of Jesus, they took that pretty literally. Faithful Jews recited the Shema when they got up in the morning and in the evening before they went to bed. And so Jesus, nobody listening to this conversation would have struggled to recognize what Jesus was talking about. What I do find interesting is that in the 5 places we find some version of the commandment to love God, only 2 of them match identically.
Oh, interesting.
Deuteronomy says, love the Lord with all of your heart and soul and might. Every time the commandment is quoted in the New Testament, there is the addition of the mind or the understanding. So what do these words mean for a good first century Jew? The heart is the self. It is the place of devotion. So God deserves your complete devotion. The soul is the being, the person, the word, it's the word psyche in the Gospels. You know, our psyche is who we are as a person. Strength represented vitality and vigor. Don't be lackluster in your devotion to God.
Mm-hmm.
And then, fascinatingly, Jesus adds a 4th dimension to this, the mind or the understanding, which in Jesus' world had to do with ethics. It had to do with ethical thoughts, ethical choices, and ultimately ethical actions. So, you know, we could spend a lot of time parsing those 4 things, but it's very clear that taken together, Jesus is talking about absolute and complete devotion to God. In every area of my life, God should be at the top of my priority list.
Yeah, and I'm not, listeners, I think the first bit of this got cut off. I'm not the technical person that Alan is.
Okay.
I think it was just a minute or 2. But what you may not have heard was we're talking about the greatest commandment, if you hadn't picked up on that from Dr. Tony talking. But one of the things I really appreciate about what you just did is I feel like sometimes people can make a big disconnect from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Like they just want to rush into the New Testament. They want to be, what is it called? Red line Christians, where it's like only things that
red letter Christians.
that red letter
because,
Christians.
Because the words of Jesus are in red in some Bibles.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. So I think it's so important that Jesus was a Jew, right? So the words of the Old Testament were significant to him and were important to him, and he's bringing these together for us, right? In all that you just said, right? In the Deuteronomy and Joshua and all the different places that you just quoted. So in some ways, this isn't new news, right? To worship God, but we have to look at it sort of in a different tone, I feel like, with the New Testament when Jesus was walking and talking and among us. And for those that didn't hear this part, I have made this statement many times that Christianity is super simple, right? Love God, love your neighbor, what we've been talking about. But we as humans can really foul that up. And so I think having the understanding between the connection of the New Testament and the Old Testament feels really important to me, but also just what you said at the end, not that we're through, but just what, love God should be at the top of the list.
Every area of life, completely and utterly.
And why do we struggle with that so much?
Well,
and
we do,
just the humanness of us, I guess.
I think that's partly how we're wired, and partly that we constantly get bombarded by the culture to embrace a set of values that revolve around self. You deserve all the gusto you can get. You only go around once, grab all the gusto. Clearly, this is a different set of values, as you say, fundamentally rooted in Judaism, but embraced and endorsed by Jesus. And I think that, first century Judaism is an ancient Eastern worldview. We have a modern, not ancient, and Western, not Eastern worldview. So it's often perilous to try to correlate those, but I'm going to say this teaching from Jesus provides us with an exception to that. Because I would say, when I think about faith, what does faith mean to us as 21st century believers?
Mm.
I think our faith has a cognitive dimension. How do I understand God? Whom I believe God to be is huge. So how do I understand God? That's cognitive. Emotional. How do I feel toward God, and how do I believe God feels toward me?
Yeah. Right.
Volitional. What choices do I make because of my faith in God?
Right.
And finally, behavioral, which is almost the sum of the first three. How then do I live because of my faith? So there we have four aspects or dimensions of faith that correlate pretty well to love God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, all of your strength.
Yeah.
So, but this is the neat thing about this story. And I said in the notes, we've read this story so many times that we don't think about what I think is an obvious question. Why didn't Jesus just stop right there? That's enough. I mean,
Oh,
that's enough.
right. Yeah. Great point. Like, that's
Yeah.
plenty.
You know, for the scribe who was sincere in asking, Jesus has given him some helpful information. For the Pharisees who were trying to test him, Jesus has given what would be a safe answer, the Shema, the verse they recited every morning and every evening. Well, clearly Jesus has no interest in playing it safe.
Right.
And it turns out that he has in his mind, I can be even more helpful to somebody who is asking sincerely by saying, you can't say that about loving God without saying in the same breath, Leviticus 19:18,
Right.
love your neighbor as yourself. I think it is not an overstatement to say Jesus identifies the central aspect of what it is to love God completely, and that is to love God's other children.
Mhm.
So these are really not two commandments. They are absolutely inseparable. Jesus helps us understand that. And this becomes so entrenched in the Jesus movement, what becomes Christianity in the church, that when John writes his first letter, he says, how can you say that you love God and yet you see people in need and don't do anything about it? If you see people in need and don't do anything about it and say you love God, you're a liar.
I feel like the point you just
Wow.
made. Yeah. I feel like the point you just made is like terribly overlooked. That we want to separate the two. Oh, sure, I can love God. That's easy. Because I can't touch God. I can't, I can just say it over and over and over, and nobody knows I'm not really doing it but me, and God, right? But when you combine them and make them one, it makes it harder to get out of, right?
Yeah. So James says, you show me your faith. You say you believe in God. Well, let me show you my works. I help feed the hungry. I clothe the, I mean, how does love for God show up in our daily life? By the ways that we love other people.
Yeah.
And so, even though we're not really talking about Luke, we got to talk about Luke.
Mm-hmm.
In Luke 10, a lawyer, again, trying to test Jesus, says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, that's another way of saying what's the most important thing about our faith. And Jesus turns the question back on him. He said, you've read the Bible. What does the Bible say? And the lawyer says, love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, that is exactly the right answer. Do, notice the verb, do this and you will live. That was the question. How can I have life? Do this and you will live. But the lawyer has a follow-up question. Well, wait a minute. And it's just what you were just talking about. Here I'm trying to make a little hedge. Who is my neighbor? Meaning, seemingly, well, whom do I have to love?
Right.
And then Jesus tells the parable of the compassionate Samaritan. And now it's time for Jesus' follow-up question. Which person in the story was a neighbor to the man in need? And the lawyer, who can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan, says the one who showed him mercy. Jesus says, go and do likewise. So the reason I bring in Luke is Luke keeps us from slipping through the loophole that the lawyer wanted to slip through and that very often we want to slip through. I'm happy to love my neighbor if I get to define neighbor.
I get to choose who my neighbor is, right?
Right. People who believe like me, people who look like me, people who live like me. I mean, and Jesus says, no, there's none of that.
Yeah.
What
it's so interesting because I did this when I first went to Church of the Resurrection, and I'm doing it again here. I'm doing this Lenten series on Won't You Be My Neighbor, Mr. Rogers' theology. And he was so good, even though like this has been written down in the Bible for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think it kind of took someone like Mr. Rogers and being able to show it like in a very public fashion, right? Like, loving the disabled, having the police chief who was Black and him sit in the water together with their feet, showing that our neighbor is everybody, right? And it's like, I just want to teach it from the Bible, but sometimes you have to bring in people like Mr. Rogers for people to like really, get it and
it illustrates
the visual, of that, or more modern, I guess, or whatever it may be. But it's really fascinating to think about because you're right. We want to pick who our neighbors are. I'm just as guilty as that as anybody else.
All of us.
I'm going to surround myself with the people that I really like, and not the people that scare me or are different than me or disagree with me. That's just how we are. But that is not what Jesus said.
Absolutely.
He said the very opposite of that.
And again, the other thing it does is it redefines love. It gives us a paradigm for love. In our culture, love is primarily an emotion. It's primarily a feeling. But in the Bible, love is a commitment to the good of another. To say I love you means I am committed to your good. My family, my friends, other people I know often stir warm feelings in me, but that really doesn't mean that I love them. To love my wife is not to feel warm and fuzzy toward her. It is to do things that result in good for her. To love my children is not about happiness, theirs or mine. It's doing what's best for them. To love my friends is not about how I feel. It's about treating them with the respect and kindness that are at the heart of friendship. And to love God is not manufacturing some emotion toward God. It is living my life in a way that I'm working toward God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven.
Mm.
So another way to say that is just what Jesus says. Love is defined by actions. And so James says, if you see somebody who's hungry and naked and you say, go in peace, be warmed and filled, that sounds very pious, but you haven't helped them at all. And therefore, you haven't really loved them. You must be not just a hearer of the word. Okay, Jesus said love. No, be a doer of the word.
Yeah.
And in the last week of the life of Jesus in Matthew, Matthew ends, Jesus' public teachings end with several parables that contrast faithfulness with unfaithfulness. And it's not about, do I feel faithful or not feel faithful? It's about, do I act faithfully? Do I live faithfully? So think about this, Mary Balfour. In Matthew, the very last public teaching of Jesus says that what will determine our eternal fate is not what we feel. It's not even what we believe, which we talk about so much in the church. But when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? Faithfulness, loving God, loving neighbor are always about actions that evidence a commitment to someone else's good. That is what love is for Christians.
I don't know a better way to end it.
Well, let me offer one quick reminiscence. I think Bible Love viewers know that Mary Balfour and I became good friends when we were both pastoring in Greenwood. I was at the First Baptist Church there, which she will testify is a cathedral-like structure with its beautiful ceiling and stained glass windows and iconography. But this is my favorite design feature of that church. I would have never thought of this. At First Baptist Greenwood, the distance from the ground to the top of the steeple is exactly the same as the distance from the entry door to the back of the chancel. Vertically, love God exactly the same as horizontally love neighbor.
How fabulous. Who thought of that? That's amazing.
I know. That is amazing.
I love that.
Amazing. May it be so in all of our churches and in all of our lives.
Absolutely. Listeners, as always, we love you, but most importantly, God does.